The account ledger hit the polished floor with a crack that cut through the low jazz coming from the main room. Sandra Kemp hadn't knocked it out of Sabine Orwellet's hands by accident. She'd done it deliberately, cleanly, the way someone swats a fly, without breaking conversation with the couple she'd been charming at the bar. "You're in the way," Sandra said, still smiling at the guests. Again. Sabine crouched to collect the scattered pages. The Caro Club's imported marble was cold through her stockings. Around her, the evening staff continued moving, trays balanced, bottles opened, no one stopping to help. They'd learned not to. Sandra Kemp ran the floor with the quiet authority of someone who had decided, years ago, exactly how much each person in the room was worth. Sabine, with her practical cardigan and her after-hours bookkeeping duties, and her tendency to take up slightly more space than the club's aesthetic preferred, rated somewhere near the bottom. She had been working at the Caro for 11 months. She knew the value of staying invisible. What she didn't expect, as she gathered the last page, was a hand reaching down to help her. An old hand spotted with age, slightly unsteady. She looked up. The man was perhaps 74. He wore a plain grey cardigan over a collared shirt, the kind of outfit that said retired schoolteacher rather than member of an exclusive private club. He had white hair and pale blue eyes and the patient expression of someone who had spent a very long time watching the world be worse than it needed to be. Here, he handed her a page that had slid under a bar stool. "Thank you," Sabine said. "You didn't have to do that. I was sitting right there." He gestured toward a stool at the far end of the bar, the end where the lighting was poorest, where the leather was worn, where no one had thought to place a drinks napkin. "I've been sitting right there for an hour. Apparently, I blend in with the furniture." Sabine stood, pressing the pages back into order. "Can I get you something? I'm not technically. I do the books, not the bar." "Then you're the most useful person I've spoken to tonight." He sat back down on his stool. "Tea, if there is any, the real kind, not the decorative kind they charge $14 for." She found him tea. It took longer than it should have, because she had to ask Marco in the kitchen, and Marco had to locate the kettle, and the whole enterprise felt vaguely against the Caro's brand identity. She brought it anyway, in a proper mug, because she'd noticed the old man's hands had a faint tremor, and the club's thin-stemmed glasses weren't ideal for trembling fingers. He wrapped both hands around the mug and sighed. "Milk?" she asked. "2 sugars." She had already put one in. She paused, spoon hovering. "Your doctor say anything about that?" He looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "My doctor is a very serious young man who charges a great deal for advice I mostly ignore." 2 sugars it is, she added the second. Then she went back to work. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday he was back. He arrived at the same time, settled at the same poorly lit bar stool, and sat quietly while the evening crowd moved around him. A server passed twice without making eye contact. The bartender, new that week, asked him politely to move because a reservation needed the adjacent seating. He moved without argument. Sabine watched from the corridor that led to the back offices. She went and found him another stool near the service alcove, which was less glamorous, but came with a clear sightline to the room and nobody who would ask him to relocate. "You have a good memory," he said when she brought tea without being asked. "1 sugar tonight," she told him. "You mentioned your knees, sugar and inflammation." He squinted at her. "I mentioned my knees?" "In passing, Tuesday. You said the bar stools were getting harder to climb." He considered this. That was an offhand remark. "I pay attention to offhand remarks. It's part of the job." She set the mug down. "I'm Sabine, by the way." "Raymond," he said. She went back to the books. He read a folded newspaper he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. By the following Tuesday, it had become a routine. Raymond was not an easy man to know. He was careful with personal details in the way that people become careful when they've spent years watching information turn into leverage. He talked around things, told stories with the names removed, offered opinions without citing their origins, but he was funny in the dry, self-aware way of someone who had earned the right to laugh at himself. And he asked questions with genuine interest. And when Sabine spoke, he listened with the full weight of his attention in a way she was not entirely used to. She learned small things. He'd grown up in Sudbury. He'd worked in finance. He was vague about what kind. He had a son he was proud of in the complicated way of men who had difficulty saying so directly. He liked hockey and disliked small talk, and had opinions about the correct way to make pea soup that he expressed with the passion of someone defending a principle. One evening, she found him struggling with a printed document. The font was small, and the lighting at his stool was not adequate for it. Here. She took it gently, tilted it toward a better light, and read the relevant section aloud. He thanked her quietly. He didn't make a thing of it. She did not make a thing of it either. That was important. The running disagreement about sugar had taken on a life of its own. He negotiated for 2.5 teaspoons. She countered with 1.5. They arrived, through what Raymond called reasonable diplomacy and Sabine called strategic compromise, at an uneasy 1 3/4 that neither of them acknowledged as a victory. "You'd have made a good labor negotiator," he told her one night. "I'm an accountant. Close enough. Accountants don't usually negotiate with this much personal investment. Your cholesterol is my problem now, apparently." He laughed. It was a good laugh, the warm, unguarded kind that a person couldn't manufacture. From across the club, a man in a dark suit paused near the entrance. Raymond noticed, Sabine did not. It was a Wednesday, when Sandra Kemp finally decided she'd had enough of whatever was happening at the end of the bar. She waited until Sabine was carrying a stack of folders from the back office toward the main floor, and stepped directly into her path. "You're not a server," Sandra said. "You're not a host. You do not interact with the guests." "I wasn't. He needed." "I don't care what he needed." Sandra's voice stayed pleasant, the way a closed door stays pleasant. "We have staff for that. Staff who are vetted, trained, and appropriately presented." Her eyes moved over Sabine briefly. "You understand the distinction." Sabine understood the distinction. She went back to the office. Raymond watched Sandra return to the floor. He folded his newspaper. He sat for a moment very still, looking at nothing in particular. Then the doors to the Carrow opened. 3 men entered. 2 were large and watchful. The kind of men whose job was to stand near doors and be noticed enough to function as a warning. The third she had never seen before, but she recognized the effect he had on the room immediately. Conversation didn't stop. It continued exactly as before. Only now it was being conducted by people who were very carefully not looking at the door. He was perhaps 43. Dark suit, the kind that was expensive in a way that wasn't meant to impress anyone, just fit correctly. He moved through the room with the ease of a man who had never needed to check where the exits were because the exits rearranged themselves around him. He crossed the floor. He stopped at the bar, at Raymond's bar stool. Raymond looked up at him. Something passed between them, wordless, complicated, the specific grammar of fathers and sons. Then Raymond said, clearly enough for Sandra to hear, "See that young woman? The one with the folders?" Every set of eyes in earshot found Sabine. "She is the only person in this building who has treated me like a guest instead of an inconvenience." Raymond paused. "I thought you should know that, before you decide anything about this establishment." Silence. The man in the dark suit turned toward Sabine. She stood at the edge of the corridor, folders pressed to her chest, deeply regretting every decision that had led her to this moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. It wasn't the question she expected. "I'm fine," she said, because that was the automatic answer. His gaze dropped. There was a red mark on her forearm where Sandra's grip had landed earlier. She hadn't thought anyone had seen. He had seen. Who did that? Before Sabine could answer, it had already been confirmed with unhelpful accuracy by 2 separate witnesses. The man turned toward Sandra. He said nothing for a long moment. He didn't need to. "You're done for the evening," he said finally. "Human resources will be in contact." Sandra's composure fractured. "Mr. Thorne, I wasn't aware. If I had known who—" "That," Raymond said from his bar stool, with great patience, "is precisely the issue, Sandra." Sabine raised her voice once during the entire scene. It surprised everyone, including herself. "Please don't." She stopped, tried again. "Please don't take any action you'd take differently if I weren't here. I don't need someone's position destroyed on my account." Everyone looked at her. Alaric Thorne looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "This isn't only about you," he said. "I know that." She glanced toward Raymond. "I think he should have a say. He's the one everyone was ignoring." Raymond made a sound that was almost a laugh. "There she is. 2 weeks of tea, and she starts giving my son instructions." Sabine looked between them. "Your son?" "Alaric." Raymond gestured, Alaric Thorne. The name landed like a stone in still water. Sabine closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "Oh, that's it?" Raymond looked genuinely pleased. No fainting, no formal apology. "I'm thinking about it." Alaric watched her. She was still holding the folders. Her forearm had a bruise forming. She had just discovered that the quiet old man she'd been arguing with about sugar for 2 weeks was the father of the most feared figure in the city's private economy, and she had not asked for anything. Not money, not protection, not even sympathy. She had asked him to be fair. He didn't know what to do with that. The next morning, Sabine arrived for her shift and found Raymond already there. He was at his stool. Same cardigan, same newspaper. One mug in front of him, and based on the color and the steam, someone had made it wrong. She didn't say anything. She went to the kitchen, came back with a proper cup, and swapped it. He looked at it, 1 3/4. "I'm feeling generous. 1 1/2. Tyrant." "Good morning to you too, Raymond." He lowered the paper. "You're not afraid of me. You're 74 and you cheat at the sugar negotiations. I mean, you know who my son is now. Most people recalibrate at that point." Sabine organized the receipts she'd brought to cross-check. "I recalibrated last night," she said. "I'm done recalibrating. You like your tea too sweet, and you've been sitting on that terrible stool because nobody thinks to offer you a better one. And none of that changes because of his last name." Raymond looked at her for a moment. "No, I suppose it doesn't." From the upper office, through the glass that overlooked the main floor, Alaric watched without being watched. He had a conference call in 3 minutes. He didn't move toward the phone. The rumor started, as rumors in places like the Carrow tend to, with a woman who had nothing to gain and everything to prove. Helena Fairfax had known the Thorne family through business channels for years. She was sharp and well-dressed, and had cultivated her position in certain circles with the same patient deliberateness that other people applied to long-term investments. When she began asking questions about Sabine, gently over drinks, with the specific concern of someone who only wanted what was best for everyone involved, nobody thought it was strange. Why had Sabine cultivated Raymond so deliberately? Had anyone verified her background? Wasn't it convenient, really? The timing of it all? Within a week, the Carrow staff grapevine had done the rest. Sabine became aware of it the way you become aware of cold air under a door. Gradually, then all at once. 2 junior servers stopped talking when she entered the break room. The new bartender asked her with transparent innocence whether Raymond had promised her anything. Someone left a folded note in her locker. She didn't read past the first line. She went to work. She balanced the ledgers. She brought Raymond his tea. She defended herself to no one. Alaric found her in the records room on a Thursday, returning files to their shelves in the order she'd found them. "You've heard what they're saying." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "And you're doing nothing about it." She filed a folder. "What would you like me to do? Track down everyone who's decided I'm guilty and present evidence to the contrary? They've already decided. Evidence would just be inconvenient for them. You could tell the truth." "I tell the truth to people who ask honest questions." She turned to look at him. "People who've already made up their minds aren't asking questions. They're building a case." Alaric leaned against the door frame. He had the habit of occupying space without filling it, a stillness that wasn't peace exactly, but something more controlled than that. "Why did you treat him differently?" She turned back to the shelf. "I didn't. That's what I'm trying to understand." For a moment, she was quiet. Then she placed a folder on the table beside her. "My grandmother," she said. "She raised me. Just the two of us, in a house in Gatineau, with a leaky porch and a television that only got 2 channels." Clearly, she paused. "She was the funniest person I've ever known. Made terrible coffee. Convinced herself that if she added enough cream, it would disguise the fact that she'd forgotten to put in the grounds. It never did." Alaric waited. "She got dementia when I was 19. Sabine's voice didn't change, but something underneath it did. Not all at once. Gradually. The way fog comes in. You don't notice until you can't see the road anymore." She picked up the folder again, turned it in her hands without opening it. People started treating her like she wasn't in the room. Doctors would explain her own condition to me while she was sitting right there. Cashiers would look at me to confirm her order instead of asking her directly. At family dinners, relatives started talking around her, not to her, and she was still there. She still understood more than anyone gave her credit for. She just couldn't always find the words quickly enough for people who had somewhere else to be. The records room was very quiet. She told me once that the hardest part wasn't the forgetting. Sabine looked at a point on the wall that wasn't quite anything. It was the feeling of disappearing from other people's minds while she was still standing right in front of them. She put the folder on the shelf. I couldn't fix what was happening to her. I couldn't slow it down. But I could make sure every day that she knew someone still saw her, that she still took up space in the room. She shrugged, small and careful. "So when I saw Raymond sitting alone at a bar where nobody thought to bring him a drink, I didn't see your father. I didn't see the Thorn name. I saw an old man nobody had offered tea." The fluorescent light hummed overhead. Alaric said quietly, "That wasn't the explanation I expected." "I told you it wasn't dramatic." "No." He looked at her with something that had rearranged itself since she started speaking. "It was better." Raymond was standing in the hallway. He had been there long enough. He cleared his throat. Sabine turned. "How much did you hear?" "Enough to know you insulted my coffee preferences by association." He entered the room and took the nearest chair. "My Pauline made terrible coffee too, for the record. I drank it for 37 years without complaint. Your wife. She died when Alaric was 11. He said it plainly, the way people say things they have made peace with across a long distance. I always wondered what it would have been like to have a daughter." Sabine looked at him. "Probably," she said. "She'd have told you that 1½ sugars is perfectly sufficient, and you should stop pretending otherwise." Raymond laughed, warm and unguarded and entirely real. And across the room, Alaric made a sound that surprised everyone, including himself. Brief and low, as though it had escaped without permission. When Sabine looked at him, he looked at the shelf. The meeting happened on a Monday morning. Every Caro employee assembled in the main room at 9 o'clock without being told why. Raymond Thorne walked in wearing a charcoal suit. For several staff members, that was enough. They had seen this man at the end of the bar in a grey cardigan for weeks. They had walked past him. They had asked him to move. One server had pointed him toward the public entrance on Queen Street because she'd assumed he was lost. The bartender who'd relocated him in the second week looked as though he was reconsidering his career entirely. Raymond stood at the front of the room. Alaric stood beside him, which was, in its own way, a complete explanation. "I have been coming to this club for several weeks," Raymond said, "without a driver, without the suit, without announcing myself." He looked across the assembled faces without apparent anger. "I wanted to know a simple thing. How does a person behave when they believe there's nothing to gain from being decent?" Nobody answered. Nobody moved. "Many of you were capable of a great deal of courtesy." He paused. "When you believed the persons in front of you had something to offer." The silence in the room was not comfortable. He described the small erosions, being pointed to the wrong entrance, being talked past by servers who assumed a man in a plain jacket must be there by mistake, having drinks ignored until a better-dressed arrival required attention. He described it without theatre. That made it land harder. He looked toward Sandra Kemp, who had been permitted to attend. 3 weeks ago, I watched a young woman physically redirected in her own workplace because she had brought me tea." His voice remained even. "An investigation into this club's employment practices has confirmed a pattern of conduct toward junior staff that I find unacceptable." Sandra's face had gone the color of old paper. "I am sorry," she said. "To whom?" Raymond asked. She hesitated. "To you, Mr. Thorne." He shook his head slightly. "That is precisely the problem. If you are sorry because you now know my name, you have learned nothing of value." He let that sit for a moment. "You should have been sorry the day you believed I was nobody." He turned toward the rest of the room. "One person in this building treated me consistently. Before she knew my surname, while everyone else was deciding whether I was worth noticing. After she discovered who I was, nothing changed. She argued with me about sugar for another 3 days. A quiet ripple moved through the room. She never asked for anything. She didn't use my company to improve her position. She brought me tea because I looked like someone who wanted tea, and she thought that was sufficient reason." His eyes found Sabine at the back of the room. She was right. Sandra Kemp's employment was terminated. 2 senior staff members received formal notices for documented patterns of conduct toward junior employees. A third received a written warning. Helena Fairfax left before the meeting concluded and was not invited back. None of it was theatrical. None of it was cruel. Alaric delivered the particulars in the same level tone he used for everything, and the specificity of it, the documented patterns, the proportional consequences, made clear this had been in progress before Monday morning. Before Sandra left, she turned towards Sabine. Sabine could have looked away. She stepped forward instead. "I hope," she said quietly, "that wherever you work next, you don't wait until someone tells you their last name before deciding they deserve common courtesy." There was no triumph in her voice, no victory in it at all. Sandra stared at her, then left. Raymond watched from across the room. "You don't look satisfied," he said when the hall had emptied. "I wanted her to stop treating people that way." Sabine looked toward the door through which Sandra had gone. "I didn't need to enjoy the rest of it." From the far side of the room, Alaric had heard every word. The offer arrived 4 days later. Alaric came to the records room at 8:30 in the morning with a folder, which was unusual enough that Sabine looked up before he'd reached the door. "That looks official," she said. It is. Those usually mean trouble. Occasionally they mean something else. He set the folder on the table. My father wants you to stay. In a different capacity. She opened it, read it, turned a page. What does this mean exactly? It means managing his schedule, accompanying him to appointments when he wants company, making sure he takes his medication, has reasonable meals, and has someone to argue with about sugar. That's a job description. It's whatever he needs it to be. Alaric paused. The salary reflects that. Sabine barely looked at the number. And if I disagree with him? On what? On anything. The sugar, decisions, what he should be doing with his time. Something in Alaric's expression shifted. Very slightly. I would consider that part of the role. Raymond appeared in the doorway. He had a mug of tea that was visibly too dark. She's going to say no, he announced. I haven't said anything yet. You have that face. I don't have a face. The responsible one. The one that means you're about to make a sensible decision I'm not going to like. Sabine set the folder down. If I accept this, I'm not going to agree with you about everything just because you want me to. Obviously. And I'm not going to pretend ideas are good when they aren't. Sabine. And I'm still in charge of the sugar. Raymond looked at his son with an expression of theatrical betrayal. Alaric said nothing. But his mouth had done something at one corner that Sabine was fairly sure constituted a smile. All right, she said. Raymond kissed her on the top of her head, which surprised her enough that she didn't object. The months that followed rearranged the Caro Club in ways that were difficult to trace to any single decision. Sabine learned the junior staff's names. She asked about their families with genuine interest and remembered the answers. She treated new employees with the same patience she had once wished someone had extended to her, and Raymond, watching her, did the same. Alaric, watching Raymond, adjusted his own behavior in small ways that he never acknowledged directly. The dynamic between Alaric and Sabine developed the way most honest things develop. Slowly, through accumulated small moments that neither of them flagged as significant until they couldn't ignore them. He knew how she took her coffee. She knew when his schedule had gone badly without being told. He noticed when she had the afternoon off in the way that suggested he had checked. She noticed when he was tired in the way that suggested she had learned to read him. He once moved a chair out of her path before she reached it, carrying a heavy box of files. He said nothing. She barely noticed. Raymond noticed everything. The kitchen happened on a Thursday in November. Sabine was in the Caro's back kitchen at 11:30, eating leftover buttered tart, filling from a bowl with a spoon, which she would have been embarrassed about if anyone had been awake to observe it. Alaric came in from a late meeting, jacket off, looking like someone who had negotiated something complicated and would prefer not to discuss it. He stopped in the doorway. Don't, she said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to mention the time. It's nearly midnight. There it is. He looked at the bowl. She pushed a second spoon across the counter without comment. He sat down. They ate without ceremony. She didn't ask about the meeting. He didn't ask why she was awake. For 20 minutes, Alaric Thorne was not the name at the end of a threat or the figure that rearranged rooms. He was just tired, and Sabine was letting him be. When the bowl was empty, she stood. You took most of it, she said. You gave me the spoon. I misjudged your character. He smiled, not the small, controlled quarter smile from before, a real one, unexpected, that arrived and stayed. She turned toward the sink. Behind her, Alaric sat with the empty bowl and understood something he had been carefully not understanding for several weeks. It was December when he found her on the roof terrace. Raymond had gone in early, which Sabine suspected was not accidental. The city below was very cold and very lit, the way Toronto gets in winter when the ice on the harbor reflects everything back up. You gave my father something this building hadn't managed to give him in a long time, Alaric said. Sabine leaned on the railing. Her breath made a small cloud in the dark air. A reasonable sugar intake and someone to complain to. A reason to be here. She was quiet. Alaric came to stand beside her at the railing. He looked at the city in the way of someone who has very little left to prove to it and is not entirely sure what comes next. He wasn't always comfortable in rooms like this, Alaric said. When I was young, people treated him differently depending on what they thought he was worth at the time. Men who didn't return calls, doors that closed without explanation, rooms he was supposed to wait outside of. He paused. I spent 20 years making sure no one would ever do that to him again. Sabine looked at him. I thought if I became powerful enough, he'd never feel that way again. His voice was level. It was doing a great deal of work. But you can't buy back what you're trying to protect against. Not really. No, she said. I protected him with everything I had. Money, influence, people who think twice. He turned to look at her directly. You protected him with tea and stubbornness. And restricted sugar. And restricted sugar. Something in his expression had stopped being controlled and started being honest. I've been thinking for some time that this stopped being gratitude a while ago. Sabine's hands tightened on the railing. You're intimidating when you're serious, she said. I'm always serious. I know. It's a problem. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, quietly, the way you take hold of something you've been thinking about for longer than you've admitted. She looked down at their joined hands. Her fingers were cold from the December air. His were warm. I'm not going to agree with you about everything, she said. I won't start. I would be disappointed if you did. Your father is still getting 1 3/4. Genuinely cruel. She laughed, and the cold air carried it up and scattered it above the rooftops. He kissed her in the quiet way of someone who has learned, finally, to want something without being able to control whether he gets it. She kissed him back, because somewhere between the November kitchen and the December rooftop, and 100 Tuesday evenings she hadn't thought to count, she had stopped seeing the man the city had decided Alaric Thorne was, and started seeing the one he actually was. A son who worried, a man who had built a fortress to protect one person, and hadn't known, until recently, that he'd been standing outside it himself. The following December, Raymond Thorne announced at dinner that the seating arrangement was incorrect and needed to be adjusted immediately. Sabine stopped in the dining room doorway. Which chair? He pointed to the one beside him. Yours. Sit down. We're already 2 minutes behind, and you know I have opinions about soup being served at the correct temperature. The table was full. Family, a handful of people who had become something like family over the preceding year. 2 junior Caro employees Raymond had invited, because he'd decided they deserved a proper Christmas dinner, and had apparently not considered that this required anyone's approval. Sabine sat beside Raymond. Alaric took the chair beside her. A new employee, first week, still learning which faces required deference, leaned toward the server beside him and whispered, with insufficient quietness, why Mr. Thorne trusted her so much. Raymond put down his soup spoon. You, he pointed. The young man went the color of fresh snow. Come here. The young man came. Raymond pointed to Sabine. The first time this woman met me, she thought I was an ordinary old man who wanted tea. You were difficult, Sabine said. Ordinary difficult. I am telling a meaningful story. Please do not editorialize. He looked back at the young man. Every other person in that building made a calculation first. How much is this person worth? Is there anything to gain from being kind to them right now? He picked up his spoon again. She brought me tea because I looked cold and the stool was uncomfortable. That was the entire calculation. The table was very quiet. Raymond's voice dropped slightly. She saw my heart before she ever knew my name. Under the table, Sabine reached for his hand. On her other side, Alaric reached for hers. The room applauded. Not for show, but because some things are simply true and need to be acknowledged out loud. Raymond raised his glass. He looked at Sabine. 1 3/4, he said. It's Christmas. She raised an eyebrow. 1 1/2, she said. Merry Christmas, Raymond. He shook his head, not unhappy at all. And the table, which had once been a place where people weighed each other, by name and affiliation, and the cut of their clothes, became something entirely different. A place where a woman who had spent years trying not to take up too much space had learned, slowly and without ceremony, that she had always belonged exactly where she was.